Good afternoon and welcome to Tiger Bay. I'm Lee Hinkle. Our president, Gil Ziffer, is home glued to the impeachment hearings. I tried to tell him, Gil, watching the hearings is like playing a very long game of Clue, where you already know right from the beginning who was the victim, who the victim was, and that he was done in by Professor Plum with a candlestick in the library, and he'll get away with it. So, our program today features repeat guest Gilbert King. We're glad to have him back, and he's going to be introduced in a few minutes. Now, let's get our program started. Here to introduce our speaker, Janet Hinkle.
Thank you, Lee. Masterful job there. But you forgot to share our news. Capital Tiger Bay members, Lee and I are pleased to announce that we have staged a coup of sorts. That's right, Club Ziffer is out, and we are large and in charge. Tiger Bay. In the newly revised Capital Tiger Bay Constitution, the word president has been deleted and the word queens has been inserted. Until our crowns are made, this will have to do. Additionally, the newly Tiger Bay Constitution revised, the word impeachment has been completely stricken. That's right, club members, Queens Lee and Janet can do whatever drug deals we want to do with Ukraine, and you guys can do anything about it. If you have any questions about the new structure of the club, you can take it up with our lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, who, at our request, twisted established law and opinion so we could get away with this. We knew he was the guy for the job. Thank you, Lee. Oh, wait, one more. It's only fitting that the first speaker to appear during the reign of the House of Hinkle is a man named King. Now, Lee is working on bringing Meghan and Harry sometime in the near future. They may ignore the wishes of one queen, but two queens, I think not. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Gilbert King, a New Yorker who has made a career out of reminding the world that Florida can stand right up there with Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi when it comes to the way blacks were abused in the Jim Crow South. He is best known as the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning nonfiction book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. It was published in 2012. And his latest book is Beneath the Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice lost and found. Both books are set in Lake County, Florida, just west and north of Orlando, and involve rampant corruption by Sheriff Willis McCall during the 40s and the 50s. Gilbert, for the rest of my life, I will associate two things with you when I think of you. First, you are a masterful storyteller, and you make your own luck through tedious work of finding witnesses and documents that provide the vivid details we see in both of your books. Second, I'll remember how you helped influence our own Florida legislature, governor, and cabinet to face our past and do something very remarkable. You may recall, Devil in the Grove tells the story of the Groveland Four, accused of raping a white woman. The men were railroaded, beaten, and unjustly convicted by a corrupt sheriff, his deputies, and in some way, residents of the town of Groveland, who just as bad looked the other way. Charles Greenlee, 16 at the time, was given a life sentence. Ernest Thomas and Walter Urban were sentenced to death, and Samuel Shepard was shot and killed. But back to the Florida legislature. As I understand the story, a few years ago, there was a group of legislators reading Gilbert's book. It's my understanding, former legislator Geraldine Thompson had passed out about 30 copies of the book to her fellow lawmakers. The story really made an impression on those who read the book. They wondered what they could do in some small way as a state to acknowledge this atrocity. In 2017, they settled on passing a resolution asking then Governor Scott to posthumously pardon the Groveland Four. The bipartisan measure passed unanimously in the House and went on to pass again unanimously in the Florida Senate. Then Governor Scott, on leave from a recurring role as Voldemort in the Harry Potter movie franchise, feared signing the bill would somehow interfere with his purchase of a United States Senate seat. So he never signed the bill. This bill would have acknowledged the sins of our past and give the heirs of the wronged men a bit of solace that their fathers have been officially exonerated for a crime they did not commit. Thankfully, in January of last year, newly elected Governor Ron DeSantis signed the bill, and later the Florida cabinet pardoned the Groveland Four. When good people on both sides of the aisle can come together and do something to help heal deep and old wounds, that's really something. Your meticulous reporting, Gilbert, and your masterful book inspired this to happen. And for that, we owe you a great debt. Thank you. Welcome to the podium, my dear subjects, Gilbert King.
You guys are really hard to follow because you're so funny and I go into total darkness. You're so funny and I go into total darkness right afterwards. But I'm going to try and make it a little more interesting. Last time I was here 5 years ago, and it was so much fun. And one of the things I remember thinking after I spoke was I really should have left more time for questions because that was so much more interesting than what I had to say. The questions I got were great, and it was lively, and I wanted to make sure I do that this time. But before, I just wanted to talk about a few topics along the lines of behind the scenes, writing of these books, some of the stories that happen outside of actual, the writing of them, things I learned about later that are really sometimes interesting, didn't make it into the book. And so those are the kind of things I think that readers really find interesting rather than just going through a regular kind of book talk. And then I will talk about Groveland and the whole process because I think tremendously this was a moment in Florida history where, as Janet was saying, a great amount of pride that Floridians should feel in their government. I think about this all the time. I really could not see something like this happening in New York. A grassroots effort coming together to sort of right a wrong for a reason, not just to be window washing and say we did the right thing, but really what the people of Florida were doing, the government officials were doing, was basically saying we want to accept some accountability because we want our courts to have credibility. We want our government to have credibility. And by addressing the wrongs in the past instead of just sweeping them under the carpet, it's an important thing to do for the state. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about was journalism today. And I don't really consider myself a journalist. I don't have any formal training as a journalist. I do use traits of journalism when I'm working on these books. I'm not a historian. I don't have any academic credentials. And yet I'm obsessed with history and the context of why things happen. And so I use all of these tools by really being an everyman. I guess what Janet said is a storyteller. That's sort of what I would say I consider myself. But I use investigative tools, journalism, history. I use everything. And a lot of what I do is really built on the shoulders of giants. There are some unbelievable historians in this state who write these really esoteric books about very small things, and they're absolutely brilliant. And then there's some that write about larger things. I'll give you an example. Martin Dykman was a reporter here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. And he really picked up the mantle in some of the stories that I wrote in my last book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun. And he's still around, and I'm friends with him on Facebook. And whenever I have a question about the history of Florida government, he doesn't have to research it. It's off the top of his head. His recall is that great. I don't know how he does it. So I've met so many people like this who have influenced my work. Lucy Morgan, who is here today, and I told you I was not going to embarrass you very much, but like, I'm going after a sheriff who's dead. She was going after sheriffs who were alive and putting her in jail. And so there's a difference between what I do, this New Yorker who comes down and looks through documents and writes them up years later, then skips town, as to what Lucy Morgan's doing, was actually putting her life at risk on some of these stories. And I really equate that to the work that Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers were doing. When he talked about coming down south, they would ask him, aren't you afraid you're getting threatened all the time? You're a hero through this struggle and civil rights and what you're doing. And he says, I'm terrified. I'm not the hero. I get on the train after these cases are done, and I go back to New York City where I don't have these troubles. The real heroes are the people like Harry T. Moore, who continue to stay down here and practice law in an environment that's deadly. And Harry T. Moore obviously lost his life in what he believed in, which was, he was the executive secretary of the NAACP in Florida. He put more than 100,000 African-American voters onto the voting logs. He changed the fundamental landscape of Florida in the 1940s. And that was a big part of why he was a dangerous person to society. He was creating a different voting landscape. And that was part of the reason the Groveland case was part of it. But the other thing is he built up so many enemies by doing this. And so Harry T. Moore is a person that, you know, I'm amazed. I travel around the country, even Florida, people don't know who he is. He was literally considered the first martyr of the modern civil rights movement. He was killed on Christmas night in 1951. Ku Klux Klan put a bomb under his home, killing both him and his wife. Remarkably, down in Birmingham, Alabama, there's a monument to the martyrs of the civil rights movement, and he's not on that monument. I think the reason for this was that Florida just fell below the radar. We did not consider Florida a part of the Cotton Belt South during these pre-civil rights years. People looked and they said, well, Leroy Collins, he's not one of those really devastating governors that are giving us big civil rights problem. That's not a state that we equivocate to Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, and the Cotton Belt states. The things that were happening in Florida, they didn't really register in the national consciousness, which I find absolutely remarkable. Everybody here has heard of the Scottsboro Boys. That was 1931 in Alabama. The Groveland case, to me, is far more dangerous, violent, and dramatic, and it involves a future U.S. Supreme Court justice. And up until a few years ago, nobody ever heard of the Groveland story. Why is that? This was on the front pages of newspapers around the world, and then just sort of forgotten. And you know, when I came across this in the files, I was going through Thurgood Marshall's files, doing some research on another project, and I saw this letter that had been sent from one of Thurgood Marshall's lawyers who was down in Florida in the very early stages of the Groveland case. And it was written on like stationary, handwritten. You could see it when you hold it in your hands, the way the pen is pressed into this paper. It's so immediate. And the letter basically says, Thurgood, we need help down here. This is the most dangerous place we've ever been. We are getting threatened constantly. We are told law enforcement is out to kill us. Please send reinforcements. Alert the Department of Justice. And I remember reading this going, what the hell is going on in Florida? I've never heard of anything happening in Florida that a lawyer would send that kind of, you know, distress signal up north to the head of the NAACP. And I started looking into this case, and you know, remarkably, no one had really written about it. It was showing up in Thurgood Marshall's biographies, but really maybe a couple of paragraphs at most. And I think we look at it because we think of Thurgood Marshall as the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And then if you look at another part of his career, he's the lawyer shepherding these landmark civil rights cases through the Supreme Court, cases in terms of voting rights, housing discrimination, school desegregation. We don't think of Thurgood Marshall as getting involved in criminal cases. And yet that was a really big part of his life. I've talked to many of his clerks, And they said, well, that's all he ever talked about. We'd go into his office, and all he talked about were his run-ins with a sheriff down in Florida and the danger. And we all thought he was full of it. We thought he was exaggerating this stuff. And so when we were reading this, our first thought was, holy shit, he was telling the truth. This really did happen. This was a real case. And even Sandra Day O'Connor wrote in her memoir that she described the Groveland case perfectly about how Marshall used to tell this story and how they didn't really believe that something like this really happened. They just thought he was a great exaggerator. And so that to me is why I think, you know, Florida is such a fertile ground, because there's a lot of these kind of stories. I write about one of them in Devil in the Grove, very similar to the Emmett Till case, preceded it by about 10 years. A young 14-year-old African-American who works in a drugstore. At Christmas time, he has the nerve to write a Christmas rhyme to a white cashier. The girl takes that card, shows it to her father that night. Father rounds up a couple buddies. They tie this kid up, bring him to the Swanee River with his father, and give him a choice. Jump in the river and drown, or take this bullet. And the kid is terrified of the bullet, so he jumps into the river and drowns. They let the body just float down the river. They take the father into the police station and make him sign an affidavit saying what he just witnessed was an accident. This is something that Thurgood Marshall worked on in the 1940s with Harry T. Moore, and it went nowhere. They could not get the FBI, Department of Justice, interested to do an investigation. These kind of cases stalled constantly, and everybody knows about Emmett Till. That really was one of the foundations, building blocks of the civil rights movement, because it brought this consciousness of, we're killing children. This cannot be tolerated. More and more Americans began to get on board with this because of these stories. And if you remember in the Emmett Till case, I think one of the most interesting and most powerful things in that story was Emmett Till's mother insisted that her son be shown in public, photographed with an open casket, to show the depravity and the violence that befell her child. And when those photographs went around the country, that was another building block that said, we cannot tolerate this as Americans. And it just started shifting the consciousness of America, so that by the time you get to the civil rights movement, there was much more ground support for something like that. Wow, this is getting dark. I didn't really want to go that. But it's important, I think, the power of storytelling. And I've been made aware of that through this Groveland case. Janet talked about the Geraldine Thompson handing out these books and basically having these legislators read this in their own book club and saying, we have to do something. Well, another part of that story was that some of the Republicans did the same thing, and they were reading the book, and they challenged their Democratic counterparts, saying, we think we can get more co-sponsors than you. And they had a friendly competition. And when we went down for the apology 2 years ago, Speaker Corcoran said on the floor, we understand there's been some kind of competition. We don't know what the final tally is, but let's just do it now. And it was unanimous, 117 co-sponsors for the apology towards the Groveland. And it built from there. And one of the things that I really just learned about recently was the role of Leadership Florida and John and Janique Daly handing out books to the members of Leadership Florida and saying, this is a great opportunity to do something. We can try and do something and make a change that would really do Florida proud. And so this grassroots effort, I think, has been the most inspiring thing. I've been coming down here for years, talking to people, and just seeing how many people were able to get on board and recognize the importance of correcting these. Granted, what does an apology do? What does a pardon do? It doesn't bring anybody back to life. But if you talk to the members of the Groveland families, as Chris Hand has done many times, you can see what it means to them, because they've been living under a false narrative. They've stayed in Lake County, and the narrative that supported Lake County was that their relatives, their uncles, had sexually assaulted this young white woman, and then on the evening of their retrial, they tried to escape and attacked our fine sheriff, Willis McCall. That was the narrative that they grew up under. They said their names were mud because of this. And they're not looking for any compensation or anything significant that can really obviously it's not going to bring any of their relatives back to life. What they are just looking for is the truth, the narrative to be changed to the truth, because they knew that their relatives were not guilty of this. And so that's a great role, I think, that storytellers can really provide in the community. I believe also lawyers can do this too, because this country, we don't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you look at the end of apartheid, South Africa, you'll see a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where they actually said, you have immunity, but tell us your stories. You will not be prosecuted if you participated in this. Let's get it out there so that there can never be deniers of the truth, that this really did happen. Let's acknowledge it. The same thing in Germany. You can't go anywhere in Germany without seeing monuments, without seeing memorials, stumbling stones, victims of the Holocaust everywhere. It's part of their national consciousness. They don't shy away from it for a reason. And I think in this country, we haven't really had that moment. We've sort of acknowledged that slavery happened, but it's been sort of like, we don't want to really dive too deeply into it. I noticed one of the things I talk about a lot is I was working on this Groveland story, and I'm going through these files, filing these Freedom of Information Act requests. I'm the one who's unsealing these after 60 years. Thurgood Marshall, the defense attorneys, they never saw the FBI reports. These were always considered still under investigation and off limits to any attorneys. So I filed these Freedom of Information Act requests. 60 years later, I'm opening these envelopes. I'm seeing the FBI reports for the first time. And they're unredacted. And so what's remarkable is that entire story, the Groveland story, is really in those FBI files. They sent a dozen agents down and investigated under the threat of perjury. And they had people talking, law enforcement agents, citrus barons, witnesses. Everything is there in these files, and it was sealed. And so no one ever got to see them. And one of the FBI agents was livid, the fact that they did not go and prosecute Willis McCall and his deputy for shooting the Groveland boys. They said, we have forensic evidence. The story is supported by physical evidence. These men should be indicted for murder and attempted murder. And it was quashed by a U.S. attorney in Tampa. And when the FBI agent wrote his report, he said he was told it was being quashed for 4 words that I find most disturbing of any of the I've come across. Tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really knew what was happening behind the scenes, they might riot in the streets. And so these files with these stories are just tucked away and brushed under the rug, so we never see them until decades later, if you're lucky. And so that is the value of storytelling, because it can change the narrative. And so I think about those moments when I was doing some research. I'll give you another example. This one brings it to the latest book that I've done, Beneath the Roof of the Sun. I was doing a book talk in Groveland, and an elderly deputy came up to me with like a big belt buckle, a cowboy hat, and he basically just stuck his business card right in my face. And all I could read on the card was Sheriff of Lake County. And it was, for a New York writer, it's intimidating. I don't know who this guy is, what he's doing. I just see these words. And afterwards, he pulled me over and he said, you got your story right. I was a deputy on McCall's staff, and everything you wrote about was true. All of this stuff was happening. But he said, there's another story down here that nobody will write about. Nobody will ever talk about. And he goes, and I was involved in this. We framed a mentally disabled teenager, a white teenager, for a rape that he did not commit. And he goes, I'm absolutely ashamed that I've never spoken up about this, because this kid was sent to Chattahoochee for 14 years for a crime he did not commit because we framed him. And he went on to tell me the story behind the scenes about how a very wealthy and powerful man in Lake County and his wife had this relationship. They were living in a town called Okahumpka, and one night Joe Knowles, the man, the citrus baron, went out of town, and his wife was sexually assaulted. And she reported it to the sheriff's department and said she was assaulted by a black man with very dark skin and bushy hair. Sheriff Willis McCall does what he does best. He descends on Okahumpka and basically takes 24 young black men, throws them in the jail, and starts interrogating them. And one by one, they start releasing the suspects until they settle on the one suspect. And that is the nephew of Virgil Hawkins, young 18-year-old Melvin Hawkins. And basically, Willis McCall is bragging that this arrest is going to derail Virgil Hawkins' efforts at integrating the University of Florida College of Law. It's a big case that was sitting before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so now Willis McCall has his black man that he's going to rush through trial, send to the electric chair, and this is going to be an embarrassment to the Hawkins family, and it possibly will end his effort to desegregate the law school. But something really remarkable happens. Mabel Norris Reese, the reporter, if you remember from Groveland, she started out where she was the reporter who's basically a mouthpiece for the sheriff and the state attorney's office. And she's calling for a swift vengeance on the Groveland Four for the horrible crime of assaulting a white 17-year-old woman. And so she's writing all this, but then when Willis McCall shot the Groveland boys on the side of the road, she has sort of a change of heart where she starts to understand that the way she was seeing Lake County through her eyes was completely wrong. And she got called out in that U.S. Supreme Court opinion. Justice Robert Jackson wrote that opinion and talked about, the issue that was brought was the change of venue and the way that grand jury selected the jurors. It wasn't random. So those were the two issues that Thurgood Marshall knew were going to win the day in the Supreme Court. But Justice Robert Jackson went out of his way. He described the Groveland case as one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. And he talked about the role of journalists in Lake County. And without naming Mabel Norris Reese, he wrote about everything she had done, how she had poisoned the jury pool, how she would reported that the sheriff had confessions which he did not have, and put this information out there. And I saw an interview with Mabel later on, and she said, I deserved to be stepped on the way I was writing, and I didn't have an awakening until afterwards. And from that moment on, she was determined to write about Sheriff Willis McCall and his injustices and the racial terrorism that he was really enforcing throughout Lake County. And she did this, but she did it at great cost. Once she started writing about this, Brown versus Board, and how there needed to be patience, how we need to work through this, a cross was burned in a front yard that nearly incinerated her house. 2 bombs, military simulation bombs, were thrown at her house on consecutive evenings. They poisoned her dog. They destroyed her office, the Mount Dora topic. And the last thing they did, which she could not recover from, which is actually unthinkable today, but it happened. Sheriff Willis McCall's white supremacist friends got together and opened a rival newspaper, the Mount Dora Herald. And it was a pro-segregation, pro-Willis McCall newspaper in Mount Dora, as if it really needed 2 newspapers. And Willis McCall went around and threatened every one of Mabel's advertisers that if they knew it was good for them, they would not advertise in Mabel's paper. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And she had to just get rid of the paper, and she moved to Daytona and became a columnist and reporter for the Daytona Beach News Journal, where the Davidson family gave her reign to continue to write about Sheriff Willis McCall, because that was passionate to her. Why? Because she knew that Jesse Daniels, the white mentally disabled teenager, was being framed, and he was sent off to Chattahoochee without a trial. And she continued to write about this and report about it because she suspected that there was a conspiracy, a bizarre conspiracy that is hard to believe, but she suspected that Blanche was sexually assaulted, actually by an African American, but because Joe Knowles was such a social figure, a prominent man in Lake County, in Leesburg, a 4-time mayor, that he could not bear the stigma of the knowledge that his wife was sexually assaulted by a black man. And so what they did was they got together, sheriff, state attorney, some very powerful people, and they changed the race of the attacker so that Blanche's reputation would remain intact and she would not be a pariah in the community. This is one of the most perverse stories of race that I've ever heard. And Mabel was onto it, and she was writing about it, and she wrote more than 100 articles about it. I started researching this, and I'd been in touch with the Mount Dora Library, or the Mount Dora topic, that said they had a leather-bound journal of every article Mabel had written every issue from 1958, which is when this really was starting to be reported, and that I could come in and look at it and make copies. And so I did this, and I was onto the story, and I went down there, and I remembered the thing that that deputy told me: nobody will talk about this story because it involves powerful people. This is not Norma Paget, a 17-year-old poor woman in South Lake County in Groveland. This is a very powerful family, and you're going to see some resistance to this. And I was told this, and initially that was absolutely the case. When people found out what I was asking about, they would just really walk away from me. And so this was what, when I descended on Lake County finally to get to Mabel's articles and to start reading these and to find out the names, because she was naming names. None of the other newspapers were reporting this. She was the only one. And I remember showing up with the topic, and the archivist came back kind of ashen-faced and said, the entire year is missing. We had it, and now it's gone. And she thought that was very strange. I did too. She said, don't worry, there's microfilm copies. One is at the Mount Dora Library, and one is at the University of Florida Library. So we have copies out there, but we don't have ours anymore. And so I went to both those places, the Mount Dora Library and the University of Florida Library. Both reels of microfilm from 1958 were missing. This was absolutely devastating to me, because now I knew that I did not have Mabel's sources for this. She was the only one writing about this. And I literally thought, I'm going to have to back away from this story and not tell this story anymore. I interviewed Mabel's daughter and her granddaughter, and they told me a lot, but they said Mabel kept nothing from her reporting career, which was strange because she'd written about Groveland. She became friends with Martin Luther King later in the 60s, covered St. Augustine, the great civil rights unrest in 1964. Mabel was one of the lead reporters on that. And she was doing all this work, and her family was telling me she kept nothing. And so I thought I might have to just cancel this book, because this was going to be my primary sources, and I just didn't get to them on time. And so Mabel's daughter passed away several years ago after I interviewed her, and I called down to the granddaughter, and I said, I'm so glad I got the chance to speak to your mom. She was very helpful. Not sure I can go forward with this story, though. And I explained to her the resources that were now missing. And she said, Gilbert, I was cleaning out my mom's attic, and I found a box. And it looks like some of Mabel's stuff. It's a small department store box, not very big, but it looks like it's Mabel's stuff, and you're free to have it. And so I went down to Daytona Beach, I think a couple days later, and I opened up the box. There was nothing from her correspondence with Martin Luther King, nothing from the civil rights work she did in 1964, nothing about the Groveland story. Everything in that box was the Jessie Daniels story. Every original article on onion skin paper with her notes and letters to the governors imploring some kind of investigation into Sheriff Lewis McCall. Everything was in there. All her correspondence, photographs, letters with Jessie Daniels while he was in Chattahoochee, letters to Jessie's mother. They worked together investigating this case, like two of the most unlikely people, I think. Jessie Daniels' mother is a watermelon picker in Lake County, and she cannot hire a lawyer. So she goes around investigating herself and asking people in the community. And she's actually picking up valuable tips, feeding them to Mabel, and Mabel's able to work them into her stories and keep this story going. And so to me, it was like this moment in history where Mabel just recognized that I think this was the most important story she ever worked on. And she was determined to see it through. I think she probably had some kind of ambitions about maybe writing a book about this someday, but her health began to fail. But she held on to those files. And so when I think about standing on the shoulders of giants, I really do think about Mabel and her shoulders, because she had this story, all her instincts was right, and she just really couldn't finish it. And so it really just took someone who came along and saw the story too. And maybe it helped that I was an outsider from New York, that I wasn't in Lake County itself, and I was interested in pursuing the story. But it was all there in those files. And later on, I was able to file Freedom of Information Act requests and get my hands on some really valuable files from the FBI, including a smoking gun document, which I've never gotten before, but they are amazing when you see an informant in the conspiracy who just agrees to speak to the FBI and the FDLE about this conspiracy. So this crazy conspiracy that Mabel was onto, that people just ridiculed her for, was right there in these files, finally unsealed for everyone to see. And so that was just an amazing moment of research and talking about on the shoulders of giants. There's another really interesting story that I'll sort of close with, and then we can get to the questions. But Mabel recommended to Jesse Daniels' mother, whose house was also burned down in Lake County. She was run out of the county herself. So she moved to Daytona Beach to be with her friend, Mabel. And she decided to walk into legal aid, and she met a young lawyer by the name of Richard Graham, who later went on to be a legislator himself and a judge appointed by Jeb Bush, a circuit judge. But at this point, he was a young lawyer in his 20s, fresh out of law school. And this woman, barefoot woman, walks into his office and tells a story about her son was being framed for the story, and he can't believe it. And he says, I just owe it to her to listen to her story. But he thought it was the most preposterous story he'd ever heard, and he promised her that he would look into it. And he looked into it, and he just ended up taking the case. And I think he told me I was too stupid to be scared of what was happening in Lake County. I didn't know any better. And so he said him and Mabel went to Lake County to a courthouse for the first hearing. And he said, I'm standing in the back of this courtroom. Now my friends are telling me, like, you're going into Lake County? Are you crazy? And he says, I was terrified because now I heard the stories about people being shot and how dangerous the sheriff was and his men. And I'm standing with Mabel, and I see these guys in the courtroom. None of them have their hats off. They got their hands on their gun. And he said, Mabel, these guys mean business, don't they? And he said, Mabel just shot me this disgusted look and said, just stand behind me, and walked straight up in front of the court. And he says, and that's how I remember Mabel. She was just so fearless, and she was the only person in Lake County who did not fear Sheriff Willis McCall. And so these are the stories, I think, that are extraordinarily important. They shine a light on Florida history. Some of it you could think, I'm talking about some of the things that are very shameful, but also I want you to remember the people who decided to stand up and to fight back. They're unlikely. They're this young lawyer who really had no business getting involved in this case. He didn't have any experience. Mabel Norris Reese, female reporter, basically just shunned by the journalism community and run out of town. And then you look back to the Groveland story, the people who were standing up and the people who risked their lives. These are heroes that need to be recognized. At a time where we have, this debate about Confederate monuments being preserved in some of these towns. What about some of the other heroes who are actually making America a greater place to live? Mabel Norris Reese, happy to say we're putting up a statue in Lake County to recognize her, because lately all the news in Lake County is about bringing these Confederate monuments that are kicked out of other states and bringing them back to Lake County for display. Which, I would, anybody who's, I guess, on the fence, I'm all for preserving history. I really feel that this is a part of American history that needs to be told. But if you have any doubts about those monuments and why they were built and why they were there, read some of the consecration speeches, the dedications of the memorial. One of them I was reading in Tampa, Confederate statue in Tampa, and the U.S. attorney who actually handled the Groveland case, Herbert Phillips at the time, he was the one that dedicated that statue. And it is just a total tribute to white supremacy. It's in the text. Let this be a reminder of the superior race. So they weren't really talking about history so much in a lot of these speeches. They were reminders of this time in America that we can choose to celebrate what we like. I choose to celebrate some of the people who made a real positive difference, abolitionists who risked their lives, civil rights heroes, and the like. So I am going to open it up to questions now, and feel free to go back as far as you want, even to the book I wrote in Louisiana. Not that. Thank you.